Hey guys, welcome back to another slow drift through history. Tonight we're going somewhere a little quieter and a lot colder. Picture it. The year is around 1870. There's a whisper of wind outside, brushing across the dry plains of Wyoming or Montana. Somewhere a coyote howls, mostly out of habit, and inside a tiny log cabin, someone's trying to fall asleep, while the temperature hovers somewhere between frozen butter and instant death. So yeah, tonight, we're talking about how people actually slept during brutal winters in the Wild West, not the movie version, where everyone's mysteriously clean and wrapped in perfectly stitched blankets. No, we're talking real frontier sleep, the kind that came with bedbugs, frostbite, and a side of existential dread. So if you're tucked in right now with a warm blanket, maybe a cup of tea, congratulations. You've already got more comfort than most pioneers managed in an entire winter. Let's begin. The problem with sleeping in the Wild West. The American frontier was basically a giant sleep deprivation experiment. Settlers were constantly moving west, chasing land, gold, or just a fresh start. But when winter came, everything froze solid. Food, rivers, livestock. And sometimes people cabins were built fast, often in a week or two. They weren't insulated. The walls had gaps, and if you were lucky, someone stuffed them with moss or mud. You could literally see your breath inside the house. And beds? Calling them beds might be generous. The most basic version was a wooden frame with rope or rawhide strips laced across it, like a giant, badly made tennis racket. Then a sack of straw or corn husks on top. Maybe a wool blanket if you'd traded well that year. If not, you just wore every layer of clothing you owned and called it good. People didn't have bedrooms in the modern sense. Families all slept in one room, sometimes in one bed, because body heat was better than pride. Parents, kids, sometimes grandparents, and maybe a baby tucked in at the feet. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. In the Wild West, modesty froze faster than water. When night fell, when the sun went down, everything stopped. There were no electric lights, no Netflix, no one more email before bed. There was firelight, if you had enough wood left to burn, and you had to make choices. If you stayed up too long, you wasted fuel. But if you went to bed too early, you lay there awake, listening to the house creak and the wind squeeze through the cracks. So most people followed what we now call bimodal sleep, meaning they slept in two chunks. They'd go to bed not long after dark, wake up sometime after midnight to check the fire or the animals, maybe pray or just stare into the dark, then go back to sleep until dawn. The idea of sleeping 8 hours straight didn't really exist yet. That's a modern luxury, like indoor plumbing or not dying of dysentery. Fire, the frenemy fire, was both savior and hazard. Cabins had a single fireplace, or if you were lucky, a small iron stove. But that meant someone had to keep it going all night. The moment the fire died, the temperature inside could plummet to freezing in minutes. Some families took turns waking to stoke the fire. Others slept in shifts. Sometimes the youngest kids were pushed closest to the hearth, which sounds cozy, until you realize sparks flew constantly. Burns were common, especially on feet sticking out of thin blankets. And for those in tents or dugouts, yes, dugouts, literal holes in the ground covered with sod, there wasn't much to burn anyway. Prairie grass doesn't exactly keep you warm for long, so people got creative. Buffalo chips, dried cow manure, twigs, anything that didn't smell too bad when burned. In letters, settlers joked that the smoke keeps us warm, which was both true and a little depressing. Bedmates and body heat now. Let's talk about shared warmth. In the 1800s, sleeping together was just a survival tactic. Friends, siblings, even travelers who barely knew each other would share a bed. You'd just roll over, mumble, "Don't kick," and pretend this was all perfectly normal. Frontier etiquette basically boiled down to, if you're not dead and not actively stabbing me, we're good. There are journals describing travelers packed 3 to a bed in stagecoach inns. These beds were often infested, sagging and unwashed, but better than frostbite. Some women travelers complained about unwanted familiarity, which is the 19th century way of saying, creepy guy hogged the blanket. Even married couples had to get strategic. In extremely cold weather, they sometimes slept head to foot, alternating directions so they could share the heat more evenly. Romantic, not really. Effective. Kind of, you did what you had to do. Blankets and bedding, or lack thereof, wool was the holy grail of winter bedding. But it wasn't cheap. A thick wool blanket could cost what a family earned in weeks, so people layered whatever they could find. Old coats, burlap sacks, animal skins. Some pioneers even stuffed blankets with cattail fluff, basically DIY insulation that fell apart after a few nights. If you had access to buffalo hides, that was top-tier warmth. Thick, heavy, and nearly indestructible. The downside: they were massive, hard to clean, and smelled faintly like, well, buffalo sheets, if you had them, were usually linen or homespun cotton. They were rarely washed in winter because water froze, and soap was rationed. Imagine crawling into the same sheets every night for months, mixed with smoke, sweat, and maybe a little soot from the fire. Basically, frontier bedrooms smelled like damp wool, wood smoke, and regret. Creatures of the night, let's not forget the unofficial roommates and the bugs. Bed bugs were everywhere. Fleas, too. Even in the cleanest cabins, animals came inside for warmth, bringing their entire insect entourage with them. People fought back with herbs, tobacco, and vinegar, but mostly, they just learned to live with it. You'd think the cold would kill them, but nope. Bed bugs are tough. They'd hide in the cracks of wood and come out at night like tiny vampires. So yes, while you're drifting off tonight, know that someone in 1873 Wyoming was scratching themselves awake in the dark, swatting at invisible enemies, and wondering why they ever left Ohio. Pioneer pajamas. What did people actually wear to bed? Usually whatever they wore during the day. Changing into night clothes was for the rich, the kind of people who had more than one set of clothing. Most settlers slept in their long underwear, known as union suits. They were made of wool or flannel, sometimes with the famous buttoned rear flap. Practical for nighttime emergencies, less so for comfort. Kids wore nightcaps, not for fashion, but to keep their ears from freezing. Adults sometimes did too, even men. Because when your house is colder than your freezer, you stop caring about dignity. There are letters describing how people would sleep with our hats on, boots by the fire and a cat under the blanket. That was just normal frontier logic, dreams and discomfort. Interestingly, frontier diaries mention sleep a lot. Not the dreamy kind, more like survival updates. People wrote about restless nights from the cold, blankets stiff with frost and dreaming of home. Some settlers swore they slept better after a hard day's work, while others said they lay awake listening to the wolves and the wind, unable to relax. It's hard to fall asleep when you know the roof could collapse from snow, or your livestock might freeze outside, and yet there's something oddly peaceful about it too. When you've done everything you can and the fire's down to embers, and the world outside is silent except for the wind, that's it. You just give in to the cold, pull the blanket up, and hope the morning comes. It usually did. Let's float over to another winter night, somewhere a bit more populated, but not necessarily more comfortable. Frontier inns and stagecoach. Stops travelers on the frontier had an even worse time. When you stayed at a hotel, that usually meant a log cabin with one large room full of straw mattresses. You'd share it with strangers, livestock, and probably someone's snoring uncle. Privacy? Zero. Heat? Barely. Comfort? Non-existent. There's a record from an 1850s traveler describing a night at a Kansas inn where 12 of us slept crosswise upon 3 beds, like spoons in a drawer. He added that one man's feet kept poking his ribs all night, but it was too cold to complain. Most inns didn't even provide blankets. You brought your own. And if you didn't, they might offer you a community blanket, which, yes, was exactly as gross as it sounds, but travelers still preferred that over camping outside. Because in January on the Great Plains, sleeping outdoors meant waking up as an ice sculpture. Sleeping outside, the frozen few for some. There was no cabin, no inn, and no real bed. Cowboys, trappers, and travelers often slept under the stars, even in winter. They carried heavy wool blankets or buffalo robes, sometimes layered over pine branches to keep off the frost. They'd make small fires, curl up near them, and hope the wind didn't change direction. If it did, the smoke and ash went right into their faces. Some cowboys slept with their boots on so they could ride out quickly if something spooked the herd. Others used their saddles as pillows, which sounds romantic until you realize it's basically a block of frozen leather. A lot of them kept their horses close for warmth. One writer even joked that a horse makes a fair stove if you don't mind the smell, and yes, frostbite happened. All the time. Fingers, toes, ears. If you woke up with all of them intact, it was a good night. Hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations. That already puts you ahead of most frontier folks, who probably fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion, halfway through milking a frozen cow. Let's sink a little deeper into what those long, cold nights actually felt like. Not just the freezing air, but the little habits, weird traditions, and half-sensible tricks people used to make it through another night in a world before central heating. Because if there's one thing the Wild West proved, it's that human beings will invent anything to avoid freezing to death in their sleep. Before bed, the night routine of the 1800s evening. Rituals on the frontier weren't exactly glamorous. There were no scented candles, no skincare routines, and certainly no cozy pajama moments. Frontier families ended their day in one of 2 moods, utterly exhausted or completely frozen. Once the sun dipped below the horizon, everything became a race against the cold. You'd finish chores fast, feeding livestock, bringing in wood, covering the water bucket to keep it from freezing solid overnight. Then came supper, which was usually some variation of beans, salt pork, and bread baked so hard it could chip a tooth. After that, the family might sit by the fire for a while, talking softly or mending clothes. The sound of a needle going through rough fabric and the pop of sap in the fire was basically their version of background TV noise. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, so most people didn't waste them. Once the fire burned low, bedtime was the only logical option, and that's when the fun began. Heating the bed, the pioneer way. If you've ever slipped into cold sheets, you know the feeling. Now imagine those sheets are stuffed with straw. It's -20 outside, and your roof leaks icicles. Settlers got creative. They used bed warmers, usually a metal pan with hot coals inside, slid between the blankets to take off the chill. It worked, but also occasionally caught the bedding on fire, which was a bit of a mood killer. Poorer families used heated rocks instead. They'd place smooth stones near the hearth during the evening, then wrap them in cloth and tuck them at the foot of the bed. A sort of 19th century hot water bottle, minus the water. Some people even used brick warmers. You'd heat a brick by the fire, wrap it in an old sock or towel and put it under your blanket. If you did it right, your toes might actually thaw before dawn. And of course, the most reliable method of all, body heat. The family dog or cat wasn't just a pet, it was a miniature heater. Letters from the time often mention, "The cat sleeps with us for warmth," which is both sweet and a little desperate. Because when the walls were thin and the wind howled, you needed every warm body you could find. Double sleep. The forgotten pattern. Here's something interesting. People in the 1800s didn't usually sleep straight through the night. In winter especially. When nights were long, they often slept in two segments, a first sleep and a second sleep. It's not just folklore. There are hundreds of diary entries mentioning it. The first sleep started shortly after dark, maybe around 8 or 9 p.m. Then around midnight or 1 a.m., people would wake up naturally, without alarm clocks, just awake. They'd stir the fire, check the animals, maybe have a snack or a drink of water. Some prayed, others talked quietly, or even visited neighbors. It was a calm, half-conscious time, the watch, as some called it. Then they'd go back to bed for their second sleep, lasting until dawn. That pattern faded in the industrial era, when artificial light shortened nights and work schedules demanded early mornings. But on the frontier, where nights stretched 12 to 14 hours, 2 sleeps made perfect sense. In a way, it's strangely peaceful, a reminder that sleep wasn't always something you powered through, but something you drifted in and out of. Like the tide, what people dreamed about dreams were taken seriously in the 19th century. Frontier diaries mention them constantly, especially in winter, when long nights made dreams feel longer and more vivid. People dreamed about home, family, lost loved ones, and sometimes food. Lots of food. There are actual records of settlers dreaming about loaves of bread, pies or hot coffee, then waking up to a pot of cold beans. For lonely settlers or widows, dreams were often bittersweet. Visits from parents long dead, or children who'd moved back east. With isolation and exhaustion setting in, dreams blurred with memory until even the dream world felt like another cabin in the snow. Some people kept dream diaries, believing dreams could predict weather changes or illness. If you dreamed of water freezing, it meant a storm was coming. If you dreamed of fire, it meant someone in the family might fall sick. And of course there were the nightmares. Wolves at the door, thin ice, or getting lost in the dark. All things that could and did happen. So even asleep, frontier life had a way of reminding you who was in charge. Nature. Keeping the fire going. All night, one of the hardest parts of surviving a western winter was keeping that tiny flame alive. Most cabins had one central fireplace. Once that went out, absolutely everything, froze. So families came up with systems. Some would pack the fire tightly with hardwood before bed, then cover it with ashes to slow the burn. Others buried a small ember under the ash, a trick called banking the fire. In the morning, you'd dig it out and blow it back to life. Matches were expensive and unreliable, so keeping the same fire going for weeks was normal. Losing your flame meant striking flint and steel, or begging your neighbor a few miles away for a coal. It sounds small, but that ember was the heart of the house. It meant warmth, food, safety. In letters, settlers wrote about keeping the home fire alive, and not as a metaphor, but as a literal nightly chore. If you've ever woken up to a cold house and cursed the thermostat, imagine doing that every morning with frost on your pillow. Beds bedding. And the art of not freezing frontier beds weren't built for comfort. They were built to survive. The most common mattress was a tick, a large fabric sack filled with straw, hay, corn husks, or even moss. Every few weeks you'd empty it out, shake off the bugs and refill it. When the weather turned bitter, people layered animal hides under or over the bedding. Deer, bear, or buffalo skins made the best insulators, though most families could only afford 1 or 2. Wealthier homesteads might have feather beds, which were warmer and softer, but also heavier than sin. Imagine lifting a mattress that felt like a bag of wet flour. Once you were under it, you didn't move again until spring. In many cabins, children slept in trundle beds, smaller frames that slid under the main bed during the day. In winter, these were often so close to the cold floor that frost formed on the underside. Parents sometimes stuffed old clothes or straw around the edges just to keep drafts out. So yeah, bedtime wasn't cozy. It was tactical. Cabin layouts. Sleeping in one room, almost all frontier cabins followed the same pattern. One big room, one fire and one shared bed area. Parents usually got the main bed, pushed near the hearth. Children slept on pallets, benches, or even piles of rags in the corners. Babies were sometimes placed in makeshift cradles, old boxes, barrels, or baskets lined with fabric. At night, the cabin was a tangle of limbs, blankets, and soft snoring. Smoke from the fire drifted upward through the cracks in the roof, taking most of the warmth with it. The smell of wood, damp wool, and cooking fat clung to everything. If a guest came, they might be offered the floor or a space under the table. Nobody complained. It was better than sleeping outside. There's something strangely human about it all. Everyone huddled together, doing their best to keep the cold out and the warmth in. Survival through proximity, midnight chores and little night sounds. The night didn't belong entirely to sleep. Someone always had to check the fire, feed the animals, or break the ice in the water bucket. On especially cold nights, the sound of the house creaking would wake people up. The wood literally contracting in the frost. You might hear wind moaning through the cracks, a horse stamping outside, or snow sliding off the roof with a soft thump. Many people described the nights as both peaceful and eerie. One settler wrote, "When the fire dies and the wind sings in the chimney, it sounds like the world is breathing. It wasn't scary, just strange, quiet. A reminder that they were small in a very big frozen landscape. Sometimes when the moon was bright on the snow, families even got up to talk, eat, or read scripture. Others just stared into the embers and waited for the grey light of morning. It's easy to forget. In a time before clocks ruled everything, people didn't fight the night. They drifted through it." What kept people awake? Besides the obvious, cold, there were plenty of reasons sleep didn't come easy. Homes were drafty. Roofs leaked. Mice scurried in the corners, and every gust of wind made the walls creak like a ghost leaning on them. There was also the noise of livestock, which often slept close to the cabin or even inside during blizzards. Chickens, goats, and sometimes a calf might share the space. Warmth was warmth. And then there was worry about the weather, food stores, or illness. With no doctor nearby, a fever or a cough could turn serious fast. So people lay awake listening to each other breathe, half afraid it might stop. It wasn't exactly restful, but it was life on the edge of civilization, and people adapted. Humans always do. When sleep became a luxury winter, sleep was both necessary and dangerous. During deep freezes, people sometimes slept too long. Without enough fuel or food, their body temperature dropped dangerously. Frostbite wasn't only an outdoor threat. Some settlers lost fingers or toes while sleeping indoors near frozen walls. There are accounts of families waking up to find their water buckets frozen solid, or frost forming on the inside of the roof beams. Some even joked that their breath built up so much frost above the bed that it snowed indoors. In isolated cabins, weeks could pass without much sunlight. The combination of cold, darkness, and exhaustion made people sluggish and depressed. They called it winter dullness, a kind of cabin fever before the term existed. So yes, sleep was survival, but too much of it could start to blur the line between rest and resignation. Sleep on the trail, of course. Not everyone had a cabin. Travelers, gold seekers, and cattlemen spent nights out in the open. They carried bedrolls, layers of blankets and canvas, and sometimes dug shallow pits in the snow to block the wind. Campfires were essential, but tricky. Too small and you froze. Too big, and you risked catching your bedroll on fire. One cowboy wrote, "You learn quick to sleep with your feet to the flame and your dreams smelling of smoke." They'd wrap themselves tight, often sleeping 2 or 3 together for warmth. In the morning, they'd wake stiff with frost on their eyelashes and horses coated in ice. And yet they'd do it again the next night, and the next until spring. The human body can get used to almost anything, even sleeping on frozen ground with coyotes as your lullaby. The myth of the cozy frontier, it's funny. Modern nostalgia likes to picture log cabins glowing warmly against the snow, smoke curling from the chimney, a family smiling by the fire. But the reality was smoky, cramped, cold, and often miserable. The coziness came not from comfort, but from sheer persistence. Still, there's something touching about it. That quiet endurance, the small rituals, the shared blankets. The idea that even in a landscape built to freeze you solid, people still found ways to rest, dream, and keep going. Because that's what the frontier really was. Not endless adventure, but endless endurance. And somehow they made it work, now one sleepless, smoky night at a time. Hey there, still awake? Or maybe just half awake, drifting somewhere between now and 1875. That's fine. This part's meant to feel like that. A slow wander through the things people believed about cold, sleep and survival when the West was young and the nights were long. So far, we've talked about how people slept, what they slept on and what they wore to bed. Now we're going to look at the stories they told about winter, the quiet myths, the bits of frontier superstition, and how those endless cold nights shaped the kind of people they became, because the Wild West wasn't just a place of guns and gold. It was also a place of silence, and silence changes people. The cold is a living thing. If you lived in a one-room cabin surrounded by hundreds of miles of snow, it was easy to start thinking of winter as something alive. Settlers often described the cold like a person, Old Man Winter, or the North Wind, or simply the breath. It was said to creep under doors, curl through keyholes and tug at blankets like an invisible hand. People talked about it like a neighbor, one you couldn't avoid. "He's come down early this year," they'd say, or "He's biting hard tonight." There was even a bit of superstition about insulting the weather. Some believed if you complained too loudly about the cold, the next storm would punish you. So most folks just muttered politely and carried on, the frontier version of not angering the gods. And on the coldest nights, when frost coated the window panes like lace and the world fell silent, it really did feel like the cold was listening. Maybe it still does, dreams, spirits. And the midnight hours. The space between first sleep and second sleep was considered special, a time when the veil between worlds thinned just a little. In that middle-of-the-night quiet, people prayed, whispered, or simply stared at the fire. And sometimes they swore they saw things. Frontier diaries mention night visitors, not ghosts in the dramatic sense, but gentle presences. A mother's voice, a familiar hand, a shadow near the fire that felt comforting rather than frightening. In a world so empty, the mind filled the silence with memory. Native tribes across the plains also had their own winter stories, tales about spirits who walked in snowdrifts or animals who guided lost travelers. When settlers heard these stories, they often mixed them with their own Christian beliefs, creating a kind of frontier folklore halfway between sermon and superstition. It wasn't about fear. It was about explanation. When everything outside your cabin could kill you, you found meaning in the smallest flicker of light or sound, the cold that shaped character. There's an old frontier saying, "A hard winter makes a hard man," And while that sounds like something you'd find carved into a whiskey bottle, it's also sort of true. The endless battle with cold shaped the way people thought, practical, stoic, unsentimental. Frontier life didn't reward emotion. You couldn't weep about the cold. You just chopped more wood. You couldn't whine about the snow. You shoveled the roof before it collapsed. Over time, this endurance became part of the American identity, the idea of toughing it out, the strong, silent type, the one who doesn't complain even when his boots are frozen solid. It's easy to romanticize that now, but it came from real fatigue. Nights spent shivering in silence, families sharing one blanket, the understanding that comfort wasn't a right, it was luck. In a way, that's the real spirit of the West. Not wild gunfights or glittering saloons, but people quietly surviving one cold night after another. Superstitions of the hearth, the fire, of course, had its own set of rules. Many frontier families believed the fire had a spirit, something that had to be respected. You never spat into it, you never cursed near it, and you never let it die without a good reason. Letting the hearth go cold was seen as bad luck, even a kind of omen. Some said it meant someone in the household would fall ill. Others claimed the devil could creep through a dead hearth. Children were taught to talk softly near the fire, as if not to disturb it. They'd toss in a bit of salt on New Year's Eve to keep the home warm through the coming year. It wasn't magic, really. It was comfort disguised as ritual, a way to feel like you had a little control in a world that mostly didn't care whether you froze or not. And maybe, on some level, it worked. Because if you believed your hearth was listening, you took better care of it. The sound of sleep frontier nights were mostly silent. No cars, no hum of power lines, no distant traffic. Just the pop of the fire and the occasional sound of wind scraping against wood. But that silence wasn't empty. It was full of tiny sounds that only mattered when you were listening closely. The slow drip of melting frost from the roof, the shuffle of someone turning in their sleep, the faint rhythmic breathing of horses outside the wall. People grew attuned to those sounds. They could tell the weather by how the logs cracked in the fire. Sharp pops meant the air was dry. Slow hisses meant snow was coming. In a way, the silence was its own kind of music, a nightly concert of creaks, sighs, and faint whispers from the wind. You didn't fight it. You listened until your thoughts faded, and eventually you drifted off. Frontier folklore, the sleepers who froze and woke again. There were always stories, whispered, half believed, about people who fell asleep in the snow and somehow lived. One common tale was of a prospector who got lost in a blizzard, fell asleep under his horse for warmth, and woke up 3 days later, half frozen but alive. Another told of a trapper who crawled into a hollow log to sleep, only to wake up in spring. These stories circulated like quiet legends, told beside fires to reassure or to warn. Never lie down in the snow, they'd say, or you'll dream too deeply. It wasn't just superstition. People really did die that way, lulled into stillness by the cold. So the stories served a purpose, a caution dressed as a miracle. But the idea that someone could sleep through winter, even metaphorically, appealed to people. It was rest without fear, sleep as surrender. A dream of safety that rarely existed in real life. Winter holidays and nighttime gatherings. During the coldest months, sleep wasn't just about rest. It was a form of community rhythm. Neighbors gathered at each other's cabins for evening visits called frolics or sings. They'd share food, play fiddle tunes, tell stories, and then, when the fire burned low, half the guests would just stay the night. No one thought it strange. Beds were shared, floors covered with coats and quilts. It was survival disguised as social life, and around Christmas or New Year, the nights took on a special warmth. People might burn a Yule log, a tradition carried from Europe, a huge piece of wood meant to smolder for days. Families believed that as long as it burned, the house would be protected from cold and bad fortune. Even the sleep that followed those gatherings felt lighter. There's a kind of peace in a house full of laughter that still lingers in the air after everyone's gone quiet. The cabin as cocoon. We tend to think of cabins as rustic or romantic, but for settlers they were cocoon, small, sealed spaces where life retreated from the frozen world. The walls sweated with condensation. The air smelled of smoke, wool and stew. And in that small world, sleep was the border between one day's labor and the next uncertainty. Some people went whole weeks barely stepping outside. The rhythm of their days became entirely interior. Wake, stoke fire, eat, mend, doze, repeat. It's easy to imagine that kind of life changing your sense of time. You stop measuring days by the sun and start measuring them by how much wood you have left, or how thick the frost is on the windows. When you live like that, sleep becomes not just rest, it becomes a form of waiting. Waiting for warmth, for spring, for something to shift, and when it finally does, it almost feels like waking from a very long dream. Letters from the frozen frontier. Some of the most haunting accounts of frontier winters come from personal letters. One woman in Dakota Territory wrote in 1883, "We keep the fire all night, but still wake with frost on our pillows. The bread freezes in the cupboard. The ink freezes in the bottle. I dream of summer, but cannot remember the feeling." Another, a farmer in Nebraska, wrote, "The nights are longer than I remember from back home. Sometimes I think the cold makes them stretch." We take turns sitting by the fire to keep it alive. The little ones sleep well enough. I envy them. And from a school teacher in Montana, the silence here is a presence. At night I feel it press against the windows. It makes you think about things you'd rather not think about. I tell myself spring will come, but the mind freezes faster than the body. They're quiet voices, but they say a lot. The West was never just about land and ambition. It was about endurance. And the long winter nights were where that endurance was tested most. How winter sleep changed after the frontier, by the early 1900s. Things started to change. Railroads brought coal and manufactured goods. Iron stoves improved heating. Mattresses with springs replaced straw ticks. And slowly, sleep became less about survival and more about comfort. The culture of endurance faded into nostalgia, replaced by the romantic image of cozy log cabins and snow-covered roofs, but that image still carries something real. The longing for simplicity, the idea that maybe there's peace in enduring hardship quietly. Even today, there's something appealing about the thought of sleeping through a storm in a small wooden room, safe, listening to the fire crackle. Maybe because somewhere deep down, our ancestors' exhaustion still hums inside us. That memory of cold nights survived through stubbornness and shared warmth. The legacy of frontier sleep. If you trace it forward, that old frontier mindset still echoes in modern culture. We brag about sleeping less, about pushing through exhaustion, about being tough. Somewhere along the way, the Wild West's habit of surviving discomfort turned into a personality trait. The cowboy who slept under the stars became the worker who skips rest to finish another task. The pioneer who burned the last stick of firewood became the person who stays up all night on caffeine. The environment changed, but the rhythm stayed. We're still chasing warmth, just in different forms, and maybe that's why stories of the Old West still feel strangely soothing. They remind us that it's okay to be tired. That life used to be slower, colder, harder, and people still managed to dream through it. The stillness before morning. Every story of the frontier ends the same way, with dawn. The fire's low. The frost on the window has started to melt. Someone stirs under a pile of blankets, coughs and sits up. Outside, the world is still white and silent. But the worst of the night is over. They made it. Again. There's a kind of holiness in that small victory, surviving one more winter night without fanfare, without drama, just quiet persistence, and maybe, when you think about it, that's what all of human history really is. A very long series of cold nights that someone, somewhere, managed to sleep through. So if you're listening to this while drifting off, take that thought with you. You're part of a very old story, the one where people endure, rest and keep going. Good night. And may your fire burn a little longer than theirs did. Hey again, still awake? If you've drifted in and out while I talk about 19th century frostbite, congratulations. You're using this video correctly. But if you're somehow still conscious, let's quietly shuffle deeper into winter life on the frontier, where everything from how you slept to what shared your bed depended on one unbreakable rule: make do, or freeze doing nothing. The great quilt economy before electric blankets. There were quilts, and not the cozy Pinterest kind. These were survival tools disguised as patchwork art. Every scrap of fabric had a story. A worn-out shirt became a corner patch. An old dress became the center square, and a tattered flour sack might become the back lining. Women spent long, dark evenings sewing, often by the light of a single candle stub. They'd stitch quietly, sometimes humming hymns, sometimes just listening to the wind rattle the shutters. The quilting frame, basically a big wooden rectangle, hung from the ceiling. During the day it was pulled up and tied with ropes so people could walk around. At night it was lowered again and the work resumed. The pattern didn't matter as much as the layers: top, batting and backing. Cotton if you were lucky. Dried grass or wool clippings if you weren't. A really heavy quilt could weigh 20 pounds or more. You didn't just sleep under it. It pinned you down. People joked that once you got in bed, you were there until spring thaw, which in many cases wasn't entirely false. Quilts weren't just personal items. They were family heirlooms, wedding gifts, even emergency barter items. Trading a quilt could get you food, tools, or medicine. Some were decorated with bits of lace or embroidery, a quiet defiance against the bleakness of winter life. Because even when you're freezing and exhausted, you still want something pretty to look at before you close your eyes. Sleeping with the enemy, mice, bugs, and everything in between. Now, the romantic image of pioneers tucked into a snow-dusted cabin misses a crucial detail. They were never truly alone. Cabins were warm, yes, but warmth attracted life. And life came in many uncomfortable forms. Mice were the unofficial winter roommates of the West. They'd sneak through gaps in the logs or under the door. Once inside, they made themselves right at home, nesting in quilts, gnawing at food stores, and occasionally skittering across someone's face in the dark. Children sometimes named them, because if you can't get rid of your pest problem, you might as well make it a pet problem. Then there were bedbugs, infamous even in the best houses. They thrived in the crude mattresses of the frontier. Straw ticking made a perfect hiding place. Every few weeks, women would drag bedding outside in the snow, hoping the cold would kill whatever was living in it. Spoiler, it rarely did. Fleas came courtesy of the dogs. Lice came courtesy of, well, everyone. People rarely bathed, because heating that much water was a luxury. Instead, they brushed out their hair, shook out their clothes, and hoped no one would notice the itching. If you think you'd get any sleep with all that scratching and scurrying, you wouldn't. But exhaustion is a powerful sedative. By the time they crawled into bed after a 14-hour day, even a lumpy, bug-infested mattress felt like heaven. The art of bedtime layering, getting ready for bed in a frontier winter, was basically a small engineering project. First, socks. Then, if you had them, woolen stockings over the socks. then maybe an extra flannel undershirt, then 2 blankets and the quilt. And if you were still shivering, and you probably were, you added your coat. Yes, people often slept in their outerwear. Pioneers didn't really undress for bed the way we think of it now. They layered up and stayed that way. Removing clothing meant exposing skin to air so cold it could bite. So the phrase "jump into bed" was almost literal. People would rush from the fireside, dive under the covers, and trap whatever warmth they had left. Sometimes the beds themselves helped conserve heat. Rope beds, for instance, had woven cords under the mattress to act as a kind of spring. Over time, the ropes sagged, and you had to tighten your bed with a wooden peg. That's actually where the old saying "sleep tight" comes from. Not from tucking the sheets in snugly, but from making sure your bed ropes weren't about to collapse mid-dream. A family affair now, privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Families slept together, not just because it was cute or cozy, but because it was efficient. Body heat mattered. A couple might share a bed with their infant, or with 2 toddlers between them. Older children might pile together in a loft space under the roof, so low they couldn't stand upright. The family dog usually curled up somewhere near the feet, basically a 4-legged hot water bottle. There are endless diary entries where mothers note, "Slept with the little ones for warmth." And some even mention livestock. Yes, small animals sometimes came inside. A newborn calf, for example, might be brought into the kitchen during a blizzard. Not for sentimentality, but because losing an animal could mean losing milk or income. So you might end up dozing off beside your cow. Congratulations, you're officially part of the frontier spa experience. The noise of the night silence in a winter cabin wasn't really silent. The wind never stopped. Sometimes it roared down the chimney, filling the room with cold draughts and a fine powder of ash. Other times it whined through cracks in the logs, sounding eerily like a human voice. The timbers creaked constantly. As the temperature dropped, wood shrank, shifted, and popped. It was normal to wake up at midnight to what sounded like a gunshot, just a beam adjusting to the cold. And then there were the sounds from outside, the distant howl of coyotes, the crunch of something moving through snow, and occasionally, the eerie stillness after a storm, the kind that makes your ears ring because it's too quiet. Children grew up accustomed to it. For adults, though, especially newcomers from cities or the East, the endless noise of the wilderness could be unsettling. Some kept small comforts nearby, a Bible to read, a pipe to smoke, or just a familiar tune to hum. Anything to remind them that there was still a human world beyond the dark. Candlelight and comfort rituals, bedtime rituals, were simple, but sacred. There was no scrolling through your phone, just a flickering flame and your thoughts. Most cabins used tallow candles or kerosene lamps. Both smelled awful, and both were mildly dangerous, but that was part of the charm. People often said a short prayer before blowing out the candle. It wasn't always pious. Sometimes it was just gratitude for surviving another day. Something like, "Thank you, Lord, for keeping the roof up and the wolves out." Then darkness. Some read from the family Bible, the one book most households owned. Others might mend clothes or talk quietly, maybe plan for spring planting or gossip about neighbors. Sleep came slowly because there was no rush. You couldn't get much done before sunrise anyway, and yet it worked. Despite all the discomfort, people did sleep. Not in 8-hour chunks like we do, but in patterns where what historians call segmented sleep. You'd drift off for 4 or 5 hours, wake up in the middle of the night for a bit, maybe stoke the fire, check on the baby, or just think, and then go back to sleep until morning light. In a world without clocks or alarms, it was natural. Time flowed with the rhythm of the fire and the snow. And somehow, between the cold, the critters, and the creaking walls, people rested enough to wake up and do it all again. Hey again, still with me? If you're hearing this while half buried under your blanket, congratulations. You're basically doing what 19th century pioneers spent half their lives trying to perfect, staying warm and pretending not to think too much. Tonight, let's drift into something a little more internal. Because once the fire faded and the cold settled in, the only thing left to face, besides the occasional rodent, was your own mind. And out there, in a one-room cabin surrounded by miles of black, snow-covered silence, that mind could get weird. The forgotten rhythm of two sleeps people in the Wild West didn't sleep the way we do today. The whole 8 hours straight concept didn't exist for most of human history. Instead, they followed something called segmented sleep. It worked like this. You'd go to bed shortly after sunset, because, well, there wasn't much else to do. You'd sleep a few hours, usually 4, maybe 5, until the fire died down or your body decided it was done for the moment. Then you'd wake up. That quiet in-between time was called the watch. It could last an hour, sometimes 2. People used it for all sorts of things, to pray, to read by candlelight, to talk quietly, or even, and this is historically accurate, to visit neighbors. Yes, some folks would get dressed at 2 a.m., trudge through snow and drop in for a little midnight chat. After the watch, you'd crawl back into bed for your second sleep, drifting off until dawn. It sounds odd now, but it made sense in a world ruled by the sun and firelight. There was no rush, no alarm clock, no work emails, just the slow rhythm of sleeping, waking, and sleeping again. Some historians think that middle-of-the-night window helped people process their dreams better. You had time to wake, think about them, and sometimes even write them down. And frontier diaries prove it. Page after page of strange, half-awake thoughts scribbled between chores and weather reports. Dreaming in the cold dreams themselves were a big deal in the Wild West. Not in a Freudian, tell me about your mother sort of way, but as quiet, meaningful messages. When you live far from anyone, with nothing but wind and coyotes to keep you company, your dreams start to feel like little dispatches from somewhere else. Many pioneers recorded dreams that were deeply vivid, maybe because the constant cold, the poor diet, and the exhaustion made their minds more susceptible to strange imagery. Or maybe it was just the silence. When the only sounds at night are the crackling of embers and your own breath, your brain starts filling in the blanks. Common dream themes included traveling back home, usually to a place that no longer existed, food, lavish meals, bread, butter, pies, and feasts beyond imagination, loved ones who'd died on the journey, and interestingly, springtime. A shocking number of settlers dreamed about warmth, green fields, and rain. It's almost poetic, their sleeping minds escaping the blizzard before their bodies could. Nightmares on the frontier, of course. Not every dream was a comforting one. The frontier was filled with loss, isolation, and anxiety, and the human brain never really clocked out. Some nightmares were practical, waking up to find the fire out, or realizing the roof had collapsed under snow. Others were deeply personal, family members who died, or fears of getting lost in a storm. And then there were the truly bizarre ones, dreams of voices calling from the forest, or ghostly lights moving across the plains. Now to modern ears, that sounds like exhaustion mixed with sleep paralysis. But back then, people often took these dreams seriously. Some thought they were warnings. Others believed they came from God, or from spirits of the dead. There's a documented case from 1873, where a woman in Nebraska dreamed her husband froze to death on his way home. He didn't. But she still made him stay with the neighbors that night just in case. Was it superstition? Sure. But when you live in a place where every decision could be life or death, a little superstition was basically insurance. The fear of the dark darkness itself was a living thing in those cabins. You could feel it pressing against the windows. After the candle went out, there was no gentle city glow, no moonlight through curtains, just black. And in that blackness, every creak, every gust, every tiny noise felt louder. A mouse nibbling on grain sounded like a bear in the pantry. A log cracking in the fire could make your heart jump. People often describe the nights as longer than time. There's something about winter dark that feels almost physical, like you could reach out and touch it. That sensation sometimes led to what frontier doctors vaguely called nervous conditions, which was their 1800s way of saying, "You're going a bit stir-crazy." Some settlers admitted to hearing voices or footsteps outside when no one was there. Was it cabin fever? Probably. But imagine being trapped for weeks, hearing only wind and wood for company. You'd start to wonder too. And remember, most cabins didn't have doors that locked properly. Just wooden latches or simple hooks. So the thought that something could come in during the night wasn't just imagination. It was entirely possible. Midnight company, in that strange, silent world, company mattered, even at 3 a.m. Some families developed unspoken routines. A parent might get up to check the fire, notice a child stirring, and they'd whisper quietly for a few minutes before both drifted off again. Little fragments of conversation, half-asleep murmurs, maybe a story or two. Sometimes neighbors in close-knit communities would agree to watch out for each other, literally. If one cabin's fire went out, someone from next door might come by to help rekindle it. That little midnight knock on the door wasn't scary. It was comforting. A reminder that you weren't completely alone in the wilderness. And then there were the animals. Horses and cows were often stabled nearby, and their breathing or shifting could be heard through the walls. It was steady, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby if you didn't think too hard about the smell. The frontier's relationship with sleep, it's strange to think about now, but for many people back then, sleep wasn't rest. It was survival. Every night was a small battle against freezing to death, or burning down the cabin by accident, or running out of wood before sunrise. Yet they treated sleep with quiet reverence. They wrote about it in letters, wished each other a warm rest, and used the phrase, "God grant us stillness," which might be the most poetic bedtime wish ever invented. Some people experimented with little tricks to help them fall asleep faster. Drinking warm milk or whiskey or both, reading a few lines from the Bible, or counting out prayers until the words blurred into snores. There were even home remedies for nightmares, like putting a small knife under your pillow to cut the bad dreams. Did it work? Probably not. But it gave people the illusion of control, which sometimes is all you really need. Dreams as stories. Dreams often became part of frontier storytelling. People would recount them at breakfast the next morning, between talk of chores and weather. It was a way to stay human, to have something to talk about that wasn't survival. One settler woman in Oregon in 1865 wrote in her diary, "Dreamed of green hills and warm bread. Woke to snow and corn mush. Felt grateful all the same." There's something beautiful about that, finding comfort in a dream when reality was brutal. Dreams were sometimes shared around fires too. In communities with strong religious ties, they might be interpreted as divine signs. In more skeptical camps, they were just entertainment, like the frontier version of discussing a weird Netflix show. Either way, they gave people something gentle to hold on to in the middle of endless cold nights. The superstitions of sleep, the frontier wasn't exactly a rational place when it came to sleep. With limited science and endless folklore, people came up with their own rules. Never sleep with your feet facing the door. It's how the dead are carried out. Don't let a cat near a sleeping baby. It'll steal the breath. If you dream of snow in summer, someone's about to visit. And if you wake up at exactly midnight, it means an angel just passed over your roof. These weren't just quaint sayings, they were ways of coping with a world they couldn't control. In the isolation of the frontier, superstition became a kind of therapy. Half-waking thoughts between the waking and sleeping, people often drifted into a kind of trance, not quite dreams, not quite thoughts. The firelight flickering, the faint sound of wind, it all became part of the mental landscape. Some pioneers described seeing memories play out in the air before them. Others felt the presence of loved ones far away. One man wrote that he heard his mother's voice whispering hymns during a snowstorm, though she'd been dead for years. Again, this probably says more about sleep deprivation than the supernatural. But when your world is made of shadows and cold, the line between dream and reality blurs pretty easily. Night as reflection. Maybe that's what made winter nights on the frontier oddly sacred. There wasn't much distraction. You couldn't go anywhere, couldn't work late, couldn't drown your thoughts in noise. You just existed, so people thought, about the land they left behind, about family they might never see again, about the seasons still to come. And when morning finally came, when the grey light started to seep through frost-crusted windows, that quiet reflection ended. It was back to chopping wood, feeding animals, boiling coffee. But for a few dark hours, between the howling wind and the hiss of the fire, they got to wander through the private country of their own dreams. Hey there. If you're still listening, that probably means you survived the long night of 19th century frontier sleep. So congratulations. You made it through the endless darkness, the squeaky bed ropes and the occasional mouse parade. But don't celebrate just yet, because now it's morning. And mornings in the Wild West were not exactly cheerful affairs. Let's slowly wake up, frontier style. The moment before movement, before you opened your eyes, you could feel it. The cold. Not the "oh, it's chilly" kind. The kind that bites your nose before you even move the blanket. Your breath hung in the air like smoke. If you'd slept near a window, there was probably frost on your hair. People didn't jump out of bed. They negotiated with themselves for several minutes, or more accurately, several whimpers. The fire was always out by morning, so the air was sharp enough to sting. Sometimes you'd test it by sticking one hand out of the covers. If it hurt immediately, you'd pull it back in and try to postpone reality. Many diaries mention this exact moment, that deep, reluctant pause before leaving the only warm spot left in the world. They called it the dread hour, which feels pretty accurate. The race to the fire eventually. Someone had to get up, and that someone was usually the youngest, the mother, or whoever lost the argument the night before. Rekindling the fire was a morning ritual that defined life and death. There was no magical spark button, no pre-cut logs waiting politely. If you'd banked the fire properly the night before, meaning you'd buried the embers under a mound of ash, you might still have a faint orange glow left. That was your entire heating system, hanging on by a thread. You'd kneel beside the hearth, hands shaking, and gently blow on it until it glowed brighter. Then you'd feed it tiny slivers of wood. If the wood caught, you could almost feel the relief spread through the whole cabin, the sound of life returning. If it didn't catch, well, you'd better start chopping again. And yes, people sometimes had to go outside barefoot in snow just to fetch kindling. Imagine doing that before coffee. The first sounds of morning, once the fire came back to life, the cabin followed. Wood popping. A baby fussing. A kettle clanging somewhere in the half-dark. Someone coughing. Because everyone always had a cough in winter. If you lived in a one-room cabin, every noise was communal. There was no quiet morning routine. You were either asleep or instantly part of the conversation. People spoke in low voices, not out of politeness, but because breath was precious. Cold air hurt your lungs. So most mornings started with whispers, half sentences, and grunts that passed for greetings. Cold again. Colder than last. Woods near gone. It wasn't exactly poetic, but it got the job done. Breakfast of champions and desperation. If there was coffee, it was a miracle. Beans were expensive and supplies ran low fast. So some families made frontier coffee, roasted barley or acorns or even dried peas ground to dust and steeped in boiling water. It smelled vaguely like burnt dirt and hope. Breakfast itself depended on what you had left. Cornmeal mush was the standard. Thick, bland, endlessly repeatable. Maybe some salt pork if you hadn't eaten it all by January. Maybe a biscuit or two baked the night before and now hard enough to use as self-defense. Sometimes breakfast wasn't hot at all. It was cold beans or dried apples, or just a crust of bread dipped in whatever warm liquid you could find. Frontier food didn't aim to impress. It aimed to exist. The art of getting dressed without freezing to death. Remember how you went to bed wearing half your wardrobe? That made mornings complicated. You couldn't just throw on clothes. They were already on you. But everything that wasn't, boots, gloves, outer coat, would be frozen solid by dawn, boots especially. If you'd left them too close to the door, they might have turned into little leather ice sculptures. People used to warm them by the fire, holding them over the flame until they softened enough to bend again. You had to be careful, though. Too much heat and you'd burn the leather. Too little, and you'd break your toes trying to shove your feet inside, and socks, you didn't put on new ones. You just added another layer over the old pair. Laundry was a summer fantasy. Frozen mornings shared warmth. While adults shuffled around the fire, kids stayed in bed for as long as possible. Mothers would sometimes heat stones or bricks by the hearth and wrap them in rags, slipping them under the blankets. It was the 1800s version of a hot water bottle. If you were lucky, it stayed warm long enough to trick you into thinking you could survive getting up. Older children had chores waiting, feeding animals, fetching water, splitting wood, but parents often let them delay it until the first light. Before sunrise, the world outside wasn't just cold. It was hostile. And no one wanted to scrape ice from the water bucket in total darkness, unless they absolutely had to. Water, if you could find it, fetching water in winter, was an ordeal. The bucket left near the door would freeze overnight, solid as stone. People broke the ice with an axe or iron poker, scooping out what liquid remained. If your well froze, you might melt snow instead, which sounds easy until you realize how much snow it takes to make a single cup of water. Spoiler, a lot. So the first warm drink of the morning, whether coffee, tea, or just hot water, felt like a blessing. It wasn't about taste. It was about tricking your insides into believing they were still part of a living body. Morning light, if it ever came, sunrise in the frontier winter wasn't dramatic. It was a slow grey unveiling. The snow outside reflected a cold silvery glow through cracks in the shutters. Sometimes frost formed intricate patterns on the glass. Delicate little ice ferns and feathers, nature's way of showing off. People moved slower in those hours. There was no point in rushing. You couldn't plow, couldn't travel, couldn't do much except survive the day. Mornings weren't about productivity. They were about reassurance. If you woke up and the roof was still intact, and the fire caught and everyone was breathing, that was success. The cabin smell. If you've ever wondered what a winter cabin smelled like, let's just say, it wasn't lavender and linen. Imagine a mixture of smoke, damp wool, old wood, and humanity. The smell of a space that's sealed tight for months, where everything, and people, animals, food, and fire, shares the same single breath of air. The only ventilation came from tiny cracks between logs, or the occasional door-open moment that everyone hated. That's why lighting a fire was also about clearing the scent. The smoke actually refreshed the room in its own smoky way, which says a lot about 19th century air quality standards. The emotional temperature mornings were practical, but they were also emotional. You could read someone's state of mind just by how they approached the fire. The quiet ones, weary, slow, deliberate, were the ones counting supplies in their head. The talkative ones, often forced optimism, were the ones trying to keep everyone from losing morale. Pioneers didn't call it seasonal depression. They called it the winter heaviness. And mornings were when it hit hardest. You'd wake up, see the frost on the rafters, and realize it's still winter. Still months to go. Still no word from town. Still snow as far as the eye can see. So they fought it the only way they knew how to, with routine. Chop wood, light fire, boil something, breathe, repeat. Cabin mornings were a group project. Everyone had a role, even children. Older kids might dress the little ones or help their mothers stir breakfast. Fathers and sons usually headed out first to feed livestock or shovel paths through the snow. Women cleaned the ashes from the hearth, spread them to dry, and sometimes used them later to make soap. It sounds monotonous because it was. But that monotony kept people sane. There's comfort in knowing what the next hour holds, even if it's just another hour of freezing. When morning meant travel. Sometimes, though, you had to go, even if it was 20 below zero. Maybe to fetch supplies, deliver a message, or visit a neighbor who hadn't been seen in days. People would bundle up in layer after layer until they looked like walking quilts. Scarves, mittens, shawls, furs, whatever they had. Then came the dreaded door moment, that first blast of outside air. You could almost hear it, the gasp, the sting in the lungs, the crunch of frozen snow under boots. Travelers often wrapped their faces in wool to prevent frostbite. Still, noses froze, ears froze, and sometimes horses refused to move until the sun was higher. Frontier mornings were not for the impatient, the quiet after. After the chores were done and the fire was steady, the cabin settled again into its slow rhythm, steam rising from the cooking pot. Children bundled in blankets sitting close to the hearth, someone mending a torn glove or sharpening a tool. The morning hours were the calm before another long, uneventful day, the kind of day where nothing dramatic happens, but everything essential does. And maybe that's what made frontier life survivable. The predictability, the routine, the small daily victories that stitch time together like patches on a worn quilt. Because in a world that could kill you with a cold wind, a cup of hot mush and a steady fire were triumphs worth celebrating. And so the day begins by mid-morning. The cabin would finally warm up enough to breathe without seeing it. Light filled the room, dust floated lazily, and the day officially began, not with excitement but with quiet endurance. And somehow that was enough. Out there in the frozen wilderness, simply waking up and moving again was an act of defiance. The fire cracked. Someone laughed softly. Someone else sighed. And life, as always, carried on, one cold, careful morning at a time. Hey there, night owl. If you're still with me, it means you've officially made it through another frozen morning on the frontier. The fire's crackling, the porridge is gone, and you've probably stared at the same log wall for the 15th time. Welcome to the long, slow, mind-numbingly quiet days of a Wild West winter. Because, see, once the morning rush was over, the wood chopped, the animals fed, the water fetched, there wasn't much else to do. You couldn't plow. You couldn't travel far. You couldn't really go anywhere without risking frostbite or getting snowed in on the way back. So you stayed inside and slowly learned what true boredom felt like. Let's float through one of those long, echoing days together, from the dim gray light of late morning all the way to another long, creaky night, the quiet stretch between breakfast and nothing after breakfast. The cabin settled into what can only be described as functional silence. Every sound seemed magnified, the crack of a log, the faint drip of melting frost, the occasional cough that echoed like thunder in a one-room house. If you had neighbors, You might see their chimney smoke through the frosted window and think, "Ah, they're alive too, good." That was enough social contact for the day. Most of the time, people stayed inside because the cold wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Temperatures could drop so low that your breath froze into ice crystals on your scarf. And remember, there was no central heating waiting when you came back in. Once the fire went out, it was gone. So staying near it was the default plan. For everyone, all-day domestic industry keeping hands. Busy now 19th century people were not used to doing nothing. They didn't have TikTok or TV or even a book for every person. So they made productivity their pastime. Women usually took charge of domestic industry, which sounds fancy, but mostly meant mending things that broke because of the cold. Clothes, shoes, mittens. Everything cracked or tore eventually. So they sewed, knitted, spun wool, or patched whatever needed saving. Needlework was both survival and therapy. The rhythm of it was soothing. Tiny, repetitive motions that filled endless hours. Men, on the other hand, whittled. Frontier men could whittle anything. Spoons, toys, tools, and occasionally just sticks. If it could be shaped by a knife, they shaped it. One traveler wrote that in frontier cabins, every man has a stick, and every stick has a destiny, which is probably the most poetic way to describe boredom ever. Kids and cabin fever children, of course, were not known for their patience, and being stuck in a one-room cabin with no toys, no space, and 6 months of snow, that was a recipe for chaos. Kids made up their own games, simple ones like button, button, who's got the button, or just tossing pebbles into a tin cup. Sometimes they'd invent stories, or act out whatever they remembered from church sermons, which sounds adorable and deeply weird at the same time. If a child had access to chalk or charcoal, they might draw on the inside of the cabin walls. Parents usually didn't mind. They figured better the logs than each other. Though some journals mention mothers scolding their children for scratching at the chinking, basically pulling insulation out of the wall because they were that bored. And yes, cabin fever was real, both as a feeling and as a term. People genuinely went a little mad from the monotony. They'd argue over tiny things. Who moved the kettle, who took too much firewood, who breathed too loud. In small closed cabins, patience was the first thing to freeze. The art of doing nothing slowly. When all else failed, people simply sat. There was an art to it. The frontier version of meditation. You'd just sit by the fire, staring into the coals, thinking about everything and nothing. The sound of burning wood became a kind of lullaby. Some people smoked pipes while they stared. Others prayed silently. Some just counted the seconds between pops of the fire, or watched frost crawl down the window like slow-moving lace. It sounds dull, and it was, but dullness had its own kind of peace. There was no rush, no clock to check, just the faint ticking of survival. Reading, if you were lucky enough, books were luxury items. If you had one, you read it repeatedly until the cover fell off. The Bible was the most common, not always for religious reasons, but because it was simply there. People memorized passages, discussed them, and sometimes even used the margins for keeping notes or tallying supplies. In towns with a bit more civilization, settlers might have had a small stack of old newspapers, a worn-out almanac, or even a single novel passed around for years. Whole families read aloud together, taking turns when their voices got tired. It was less about entertainment and more about keeping the brain from freezing over too. And if you couldn't read, you listened. Stories were currency. People retold old legends, ghost tales, or family histories in low, sleepy voices, the same ones you might be hearing right now, music and homemade instruments. Music was the Netflix of the 1800s. Simple, portable, and guaranteed to distract you from the cold. If someone in the house owned a fiddle, that made them a celebrity. Even a harmonica could turn a freezing evening into a small concert. Sometimes, people made their own instruments. Wooden flutes from willow branches, banjos from scrap wood and animal hide, or even spoons clicked together in rhythm. Songs were usually old folk tunes, hymns, or anything that reminded them of warmer days. The melodies were repetitive, easy to hum, and most importantly, easy to play when your fingers were half numb. If you've ever heard O Susanna or Home on the Range, imagine those being sung softly by firelight. Voices slightly off-key, smoke drifting upward, and everyone too tired to care about harmony. That was frontier music, and imperfect but human. Letters to no one in particular. On long winter afternoons, some people wrote letters. Not because the mail would actually go anywhere, it often didn't, for months, but because writing helped them feel connected to the world. They'd write to relatives back east or to friends who'd moved away, describing the snow, the cold, the endless sameness. They'd talk about crops that froze, or neighbors who hadn't been seen in weeks, or the baby's first tooth. Sometimes those letters never got sent. They stayed folded in trunks or tucked behind Bible pages, found years later by descendants wondering why their great-great-grandfather wrote so much about the wind that never ends. There's something deeply tender about that. People reaching out into silence, hoping someone might eventually read their thoughts. Afternoon, the illusion of warmth around midday. If the sun was kind, you might feel a tiny hint of warmth, just enough to tempt you outside. The snow glittered, the air looked almost soft, and for a brief hour or two, life didn't feel like a punishment. Men often used that window to check traps, chop extra wood, or shovel the roof so it wouldn't collapse. Women took laundry outside to freeze dry, literally hanging it in sub-zero air, where it froze solid and then, over time, dried by sublimation. Which sounds fancy, but basically means waiting several days and hoping it doesn't smell worse. Children were finally allowed out to play. They'd build snowmen, slide on frozen creeks, or just run around yelling, which probably felt amazing after being trapped inside with adults. Some made sleds from old barrel lids. Others played fox and geese, running in circles through the snow. But outdoor play didn't last long. After 20 or 30 minutes, fingers started burning, toes went numb, and it was back inside for the usual round of thawing and complaining. The indoor glow as the afternoon light dimmed again. Everything took on that warm golden hue of firelight and fatigue. You'd hear the gentle clatter of dinner being prepared, which, let's be honest, was probably just another pot of beans. The cabin filled with a thick mix of smoke, steam, and the faint smell of old wool. This was the quietest part of the day, not because people were sleeping, but because they were conserving energy. Every movement felt deliberate, every sound soft. You could almost feel time slowing down to match the rhythm of the crackling fire. It's strange. The frontier looked harsh, but inside those little log cabins, there was often an odd sense of calm. Not comfort exactly, but endurance made peaceful. The social event of the season, visiting the neighbors. If the weather wasn't too cruel, families might decide to go visiting, which meant bundling up like mummified bears, trudging through snow for half an hour, and knocking on another family's door just to sit by their fire for a change. Visits were small, slow, and deeply appreciated. You'd bring a pie or a jar of preserves, or maybe just gossip. The hosts would offer coffee if they had any, or hot water if they didn't. Then everyone would talk about the weather, which was basically the only topic anyone had. They might swap news from travelers, or trade small things: needles, cloth scraps, dried herbs. Kids would play quietly in corners, and for a few hours, the world felt bigger again. When it was time to go home, The journey back through the freezing dark was miserable, but people did it anyway, because the visit was worth it. In a world that small human contact was as precious as firewood, the subtle passage of time one of the strangest things about frontier winters was how time lost its edges. Days and nights blurred. Weeks drifted by without any real change. You stopped keeping track of dates because they didn't mean much. Every day was simply cold, less cold or colder than yesterday. People measured time by practical things: how many logs left in the pile, how much flour left in the barrel, how many candles before spring. When you live like that, your sense of progress changes. You stop chasing excitement and start valuing endurance. Each sunrise is an achievement. Each warm meal a minor miracle. It's not glamorous, but it's quietly heroic. The frontier version of hope. Even in the bleakest stretches, people held on to small signs of hope. A day when the roof stopped dripping meant the snow was melting. A robin sighting near the barn meant spring might not be imaginary after all. A letter finally arriving meant someone, somewhere, still remembered you. Some settlers marked passing days with tally marks on the wall or small cuts in the window frame. Others prayed every morning for mild weather. And some just focused on the next task, because if you could keep your hands busy, your mind stayed quiet. It's strange, but in that monotony, there was a kind of mindfulness long before the word existed. They didn't seek distraction. They endured the present moment fully, because that's all they had. As the light fades again by late afternoon, the sun would start its slow retreat, and shadows lengthened across the floorboards. Someone would add another log to the fire. Someone else would sigh, stretch, and maybe hum a tune that reminded them of home. And outside, the world returned to blue-gray silence, snow crunching, wind sighing, the faint creak of trees bowing under frost. Inside, the cabin became a little island of warmth in a sea of ice, a place where people waited together for spring, not with excitement, but with quiet faith, because that's what frontier winters really were: a long, cold meditation on patience, resilience, and the small, glowing comfort of surviving another day. Hey there, drifter. Welcome back to the firelight. We've made it through another long frontier day, one filled with chores, silence, and the slow tick of survival. Now the sky is fading again, and the air outside is turning that familiar shade of blue-gray that promises another frozen night. You can almost hear it, the soft groan of the wind against the cabin walls, the snow settling, the distant call of nothing at all. It's evening in the Wild West. Time to start thinking about sleep again, though sleep back then was not quite the cozy escape we imagine today. It was slower, heavier, and sometimes almost spiritual in its stillness. So, let's drift through a winter night together, the kind that seemed to last forever, half in dreams, half in cold reality. Dusk, when the world disappeared. The first thing you noticed as the sun went down was the dark. Not the urban, polite kind of dark we know today. No street lamps, no porch lights, not even a moon sometimes. This was total enveloping darkness, the kind that made the cabin feel like a little wooden boat floating in an endless black sea. Candles were precious, so people didn't light them freely. You might have one small tallow candle burning near the hearth, its weak flame flickering like it was trying to apologize for existing. It didn't brighten much, just enough to make shadows deeper. By this hour, most chores were done. The animals were fed. Dinner was eaten. The fire was banked and humming softly, the heart of the cabin pulsing with slow warmth. The silence was immense, the kind of silence that had texture. You could hear your own heartbeat, the slow creak of cooling logs, maybe a soft cough from someone across the room. And that's when the night truly began. Evenings were for Story's frontier. Evenings weren't lively. They were gentle. After dinner, People gathered close to the fire, not for excitement but for company. The flames did most of the talking. Still, there was usually one storyteller. In every family, it might be the oldest person, a grandmother who remembered a time before railroads, or maybe a father who'd crossed the plains and liked to embellish the details just a bit each winter. Stories wandered slowly, like the people who told them. They didn't rush to the point. Sometimes there wasn't even a point. Just drifting memories. How someone lost a boot in the river. How the stars looked different out west. How a cow once chased a preacher through the yard. Children listened wide-eyed, even if they'd heard the same stories 50 times. Adults nodded quietly, occasionally smiling at familiar exaggerations. The stories weren't really about entertainment. They were a way of remembering who you were, of reminding yourself that your tiny cabin was connected to a much larger world. When the storyteller's voice finally faded, the fire did too, and everyone sat in the dim glow for a while longer, thinking, dozing, or staring at nothing. Preparing for another cold sleep bedtime wasn't a set hour. It happened when the fire dimmed low enough that the room began to shiver again. People yawned, stretched, and started the slow process of layering up for another long freeze. Someone would bank the fire, pushing the embers together and burying them under a soft mound of ash to keep them alive until morning. It was a delicate art. Too much ash and the fire suffocated. Too little and it burned out too soon. It's not an exaggeration to say families' lives depended on getting that right. Next came the blankets. Wool, fur, anything heavy enough to trap heat. If you'd had the luxury of hot stones or a pan of coals, you'd warm the bed first, then remove them before lying down. Otherwise, you relied on sheer body heat and optimism. Everyone took their place, same as always. The youngest near the middle, the oldest nearest the fire. Parents sometimes shared beds with children, not for affection but for warmth. Privacy was optional. Frostbite wasn't. 2 sleeps. Not one. Here's a strange thing. People back then often didn't sleep straight through the night. They practiced what historians call segmented sleep. That meant they'd drift off after dusk, the first sleep, and wake up around midnight or so. Then, after a quiet period of wakefulness, they'd go back down for their second sleep. This wasn't insomnia. It was just how pre-industrial humans operated. When there's no electric light and nothing urgent to do, your body follows a natural rhythm. During that middle-of-the-night interval, people might stir the fire, check on animals, whisper quietly, pray, or even share dreams. Some used it for intimacy, others for contemplation. One diary from 1846 described it as the most peaceful hour, when all is still and thoughts come easy. Imagine that. Waking in the middle of the night not to scroll or panic, but to simply exist in the half-dark, listening to the soft breathing of your family, the wind murmuring outside, and the slow tick of time. The dream world of the frontier dreams were a big deal out here. When your waking life was this monotonous, your mind went wild the moment it could. People dreamed about summer, about faraway cities, about relatives they hadn't seen in years. They dreamed of food, rich feasts, fruit, sugar, fresh bread. Hunger had a way of sneaking into the subconscious. Sometimes dreams felt prophetic. There are plenty of accounts of settlers believing their dreams were messages about weather, death, or direction. When your world was small and quiet, your inner world started talking louder. A woman in Nebraska once wrote that she dreamed of spring, as if it were a person walking toward the cabin. She said she could feel the warmth of its hand before she woke, only to find frost on her pillow. It's a little heartbreaking, but also oddly beautiful. Dreams were the only part of life not bound by cold or distance. They were, in a sense, the only time people were free. Restlessness in the night, of course. Not everyone slept peacefully. The cold, the creaks, the occasional scurry of mice, all of it made sleep fragile. A strong gust of wind could shake the whole cabin. If snow built up on the roof, it might fall suddenly with a muffled crash that sent everyone bolting upright. Sometimes, people lay awake worrying about dwindling food, about illness, about whether spring would ever actually come. There wasn't much to distract you from your thoughts at 3 in the morning. Parents often checked on their children, adjusting blankets, listening for breathing. Coughs were feared, because every cough could turn into something worse. Medicine was scarce and cold nights were merciless, so even sleep came with a layer of vigilance, a strange mix of rest and readiness, of surrender and survival. The cabin soundscape. If you could record the sound of a frontier night, it would be oddly soothing. The rhythmic crackle of dying embers, the occasional pop as sap burst in the wood, the soft rustle of straw mattresses as people shifted, wind pressing against the shutters, snow sliding off the roof with a gentle sigh. There was a deep, natural rhythm to it, a living lullaby of wood, air, and time. You can almost imagine lying there, half awake, wrapped in layers of scratchy warmth, eyes closed, listening to the small symphony of a world that had no clocks, no cars, no buzz, just the quiet pulse of existence. It must have been both comforting and humbling, knowing that, outside those thin walls, nature went on without noticing you. The night watchers, every so often, someone in the family had to stay up. Not by choice, but by duty. If there were animals in a shed, someone might check to ensure they hadn't frozen. If wolves or coyotes were near, a watchman might sit by the window with a rifle across his knees, listening for distant howls. For the night watchers, time moved differently. They described it as watching the dark breathe. Each minute stretched, each sound mattered. Sometimes they prayed, sometimes they hummed, sometimes they just stared at the faint glow of the fire until it blurred into thought. It's the kind of solitude that rewires your brain. You start to feel the weight of every creak and every heartbeat, like you're the only person alive. But in that stillness there was also peace, a sense of connection to something vast and unknowable. Nightmares and things that go creak in the dark, of course. With all that stillness came imagination. Settlers were often deeply superstitious. They told stories about ghost lights in the snow, strange figures on the prairie, or voices that carried in the wind. When you live miles from anyone else, the mind fills in the silence. A sudden knock of a loose shutter could feel like a visitor. A groan of ice on the roof could sound like footsteps. And when the fire flickered low, shadows danced across the walls like they had opinions. Even the bravest cowhands admitted to getting spooked now and then. But mostly, people just pulled the blanket higher, whispered a prayer, and hoped morning would come soon. The return to sleep eventually. Exhaustion always won. Whether you were thinking, praying, or simply trying not to imagine ghost coyotes in the corner, your body gave in. The warmth from the banked fire spread slowly. The blankets grew heavier, and the dark softened around the edges. Sleep came like fog, quiet, complete, without warning. And in that sleep people found escape. The dreams weren't always pleasant, but they were away from cold, away from hunger, away from the endless white. If you think about it, frontier life revolved around chasing these brief moments of relief, warmth, silence, rest. Night wasn't just for sleeping. It was for forgetting for a few hours how hard everything was. The night before the next morning, by the time dawn began hinting at the edges of the frost-covered window, the cabin was quiet again, only soft breathing and the faint hiss of a dying fire. Someone would stir soon. Someone would cough. Someone would mutter cold again like a daily mantra, and the cycle would begin once more. Frontier nights didn't end, They just slowly became mornings. The world never truly woke up. It just shifted shades. And for the people who lived through those endless winters, that rhythm, sleep, wake, freeze, repeat and became life itself, the philosophy of frontier sleep. Maybe that's the quiet lesson buried in all this frost. People in the Wild West didn't chase rest. They worked for it. They earned every minute of warmth, every half-dreamed moment of peace. And when they slept, it wasn't luxurious. It was necessary, sacred, and pure survival. They learned to live with the dark, to trust the silence, and to find a strange kind of beauty in the monotony of endurance. Because when the world outside is made of ice and isolation, the smallest comfort, a glowing ember, a shared blanket, a gentle dream can feel like eternity. Hey there, wanderer. We've made it. After months of frost and silence, the first signs of change are whispering through the plains. The endless white is breaking apart. The snow no longer creaks beneath your boots. It sighs, melting, softening, surrendering. The air smells different now. Less like smoke and pine, and more like something distant but alive. Wet soil, thawing wood, and faint traces of grass daring to return. It's early spring on the American frontier, and even though the cold still lingers like an unwelcome guest, people can feel that the world is beginning to breathe again. The sound of thaw. The first sound of spring wasn't bird song or laughter. It was dripping. All day, tiny rivulets of water trickled from the eaves, from branches, from the cracks in the roof where ice had built up for months. Plink, plink, plink. Every drop was a promise that the season of endurance was ending. At night, those drips froze again into delicate spears of glass, only to melt again the next morning. It was as if the world itself couldn't decide whether to sleep or wake. The snow turned soft underfoot, heavy and wet. Children made slush angels instead of snow ones. Men trudged through mud that sucked at their boots with every step. The sound of wind changed too, no longer razor-sharp but rounder, heavier, carrying the smell of thawing earth. Inside the cabin, you could almost feel the air loosen its grip. You'd wake to find the frost patterns on the windows shrinking, like ghosts retreating into the glass. The cabin awakens. The first warm mornings brought an unfamiliar feeling. Noise. Tiny noises. But after a silent winter, even small ones felt monumental. A mouse scratching in the corner. The flutter of a bird investigating the roof. The crack of wood expanding with moisture. The hearth no longer demanded constant tending. You could let the fire die a little during the day, and no one would freeze. It felt like freedom. Fragile, smoky freedom. People opened the shutters for the first time in weeks. The light was blinding, harsh against the pale faces that had lived too long in candle glow. Even the shadows looked different, sharper, more alive. The cabin smelled of damp wool and ashes, but also hope. Someone might say softly, spring's coming. Not as excitement, but as a cautious prayer. The first tasks of spring didn't mean rest. It meant work. Months of idleness had left tools rusted, fences collapsed, and animals lean. The thaw revealed everything winter had hidden. Broken wagons, sunken roofs, dead livestock, forgotten chores. Men took up axes and hammers. Women scrubbed floors blackened by months of smoke and soot. Children fetched water, swept porches, and shook out every blanket that hadn't been washed since the first frost. It was dirty work. Everything was mud. Mud in boots, mud on skirts, mud on faces. But it was living work, movement, sound, effort. After a season of stillness, the soreness felt like resurrection. The smell of wet earth frontier diaries often mention it, that first smell of thawing soil. It hit you suddenly, somewhere between late February and early March, depending on where you were. It was strong and raw, like something ancient waking up beneath your feet. Settlers wrote about how that smell could make you cry without knowing why. It was a reminder of everything the winter had taken, and everything it hadn't. It meant seeds could soon return to the ground. Animals could find grass again, and maybe, just maybe, life could feel possible. Even the air changed texture, softer, wetter, full of potential. The cold was still there, but it no longer ruled. People began to venture out after so many months indoors. Stepping outside felt almost dangerous. The brightness was overwhelming. The open sky too large. The sounds of running water and wind in trees. They made your heart race like meeting an old friend you thought was dead. Families began visiting neighbors again. You'd see distant figures trudging through melting snow to share stories, trade supplies, or just confirm that everyone had survived the winter. Some carried jars of preserves, others brought kindling, and all brought conversation, that rarest of luxuries after so much silence. Laughter returned, hesitant at first, but real. You'd hear it echoing faintly across the hills, small human proof that the world hadn't ended after all. Animals in the thaw, the livestock were the first to feel it. Cows lowed impatiently at their pens, horses pawed at softening ground, chickens wandered out blinking at the light. Wild creatures emerged too, deer lean and ghostly, coming closer to cabins to find shoots of grass. Ravens circled above as if recounting the living, and then one morning you'd hear it, the first songbird, a single defiant note in a world still mostly grey. That sound could bring tears to hardened faces. It was the sound of everything restarting. Spring cleaning of the soul cleaning in early spring wasn't just about tidiness. It was ritual. A symbolic shedding of everything heavy, stale and silent that winter had pressed into your bones. Women scrubbed every board, opened every window, shook rugs into the wind. Men repaired tools, rethatched roofs, patched leaks and mended fences. Children washed faces, hair and clothes in freezing water that somehow felt purifying. By the end of the day, the cabin smelled like wet wood and soap. The walls still leaned a little, the roof still creaked. But it felt new again, alive. And when the family sat down for supper, with the shutters open and the sunset painting everything gold, the food tasted different. Not better, just earned. The first nights of spring. The nights were strange then. Not truly warm, but no longer deadly cold. You could hear the world again, frogs croaking from distant ponds, the hiss of melting snow sliding off the roof, the whisper of wind through thawed branches. People slept lighter. Dreams shifted from hunger and fear to movement, walking, planting, traveling. One settler's diary described spring dreams as dreams with color again. The air inside the cabin was damp, carrying the smell of earth and smoke. The blankets felt lighter, the darkness softer. It was as though even the night had loosened its grip. Planting hope soon came the moment everyone waited for, planting season. Men tested the soil by touch, by instinct. When the mud stopped clinging too tight, it was time. The rhythm of shovels, the creak of wagons, the grunt of oxen, the music of survival. Women prepared seeds carefully, each one a tiny prayer wrapped in skin. They knew every seed that failed meant hunger later. But there was joy in it too, in trusting the earth again, in believing that the same ground that froze them half to death could also feed them. Children ran barefoot in puddles, shouting, chasing chickens. For the first time in months, laughter didn't echo. It blended with the wind, becoming part of the living world again. The river breaks, and then one day it happened. The river broke. All winter it had been a white road, silent and frozen solid. Now it cracked, groaned and split open with a deep sound like thunder beneath the ground. Massive chunks of ice drifted away, crashing and grinding like old bones breaking. The current roared back to life, carrying twigs, leaves and the remains of a long season. For the people who lived near it, That was the true beginning of spring. The water meant travel, trade, fishing, life. They stood on the banks watching, breathless, as if they were witnessing resurrection itself. The world smells like possibility, with the snow gone. The land looked wounded, brown, raw, full of scars from frost and flood. But to the settlers it was beautiful, because it meant choice. It meant tomorrow could be something different than yesterday. They knew more cold would come. Spring in the frontier wasn't gentle. There would be floods, storms, sickness. But still, the color was back. Green at the edges of the fields, blue in the sky instead of gray, and a little red in their cheeks again. It was enough. The lesson of the thaw if winter taught them endurance, spring taught them gratitude. Every drop of water, every sprout of green, every bird's cry, it all felt miraculous, because they'd earned it. They'd survived the months that tried to erase them. They didn't celebrate loudly. They didn't have parades or festivals. They simply lived softer, breathed slower, smiled more, and let the sunlight touch their faces without flinching. Frontier people understood something we've mostly forgotten, that the world doesn't owe you warmth or comfort or spring. You take what comes, survive what hurts, and when life gives you a thaw, you hold it like a sacred gift. The cabin in the sunlight by late March, the cabin that had once been a coffin of snow, now looked like part of the earth again. Moss grew on the roof. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney. A small garden plot was marked out behind it, waiting for the first seeds. Children played outside until dusk. A man sat on the porch, whittling. A woman hung laundry that flapped in the cool breeze. And for the first time in what felt like forever, nobody was thinking about survival. They were thinking about living, closing scene, the return of color if you could stand there, on that patch of muddy frontier ground, and look out at the horizon. You'd see it. A faint green haze spreading across the fields, the sun sinking gold behind distant hills, and a sky that finally, mercifully, wasn't gray anymore. The long winter had ended, not with a shout, but with a slow exhale. The land had remembered how to be alive, and so had its people. Hey there, sleepy traveler. We've reached the last stretch of our long, quiet journey through the Wild West winter. The fires have burned low, the snow has melted, and now the world is starting over, not with celebration, but with quiet persistence. The frontier didn't have much room for leisure. When spring came, so did the work. Endless, necessary grounding work. And in that steady rhythm of rebuilding, people found something close to peace, the work of renewal. The first warm weeks were a blur of motion. Cabins were patched, fences rebuilt, barns rethatched. Everything that winter had broken had to be made whole again. If something leaned, you straightened it. If something cracked, you mended it. There was no one else to do it. Men repaired wagons and sharpened plows. Women sewed until their fingers ached. New curtains, patched shirts, fresh quilts. Children fetched water, fed livestock, and carried messages between neighbors. It wasn't glamorous, but it was purposeful. And purpose was a kind of medicine after months of stillness. Every hammer strike was a small defiance against the cold months past. Every planted seed a whispered belief that the earth would be kind this year. The gentle return of routine by May, life had rhythm again. Mornings began with roosters and the smell of wood smoke. Days rolled through chores. And evenings settled softly with the sound of frogs and crickets. People rose with the sun and slept with it too. No rush. No noise, no clocks ticking their lives away. Just the steady pulse of the land. And though they never said it aloud, there was a quiet pride in having made it through. Because survival wasn't heroic. It was just ordinary, patient, human. Tomorrow will be work again. But tonight is just rest. Pure, quiet rest. And that's where we'll leave them. The settlers who outlasted the long winter. rebuilt their little worlds and drifted to sleep beneath a sky full of stars. Thanks for staying awake, or not, through this slow wander across the frozen frontier. If you're still with me, close your eyes, breathe in, and imagine that last soft breeze of spring passing over the prairie. It's warm now. It's safe. You made it through the winter too. Soft pause. Good night, traveler.